The country dance had already begun when the Duke of Ashfield crossed the whole length of the assembly room, past the daughters of every ambitious mother in 3 parishes, and stopped before the one woman in it that no one had thought to watch. The fiddles were sawing out a reel, and the candles were guttering in the August heat, and the floor was a bright turning wheel of muslin and silk, and into all that motion he walked straight and unhurried, and the wheel seemed to slow around him, for a duke is a rare beast in a Somerset assembly, and every eye in the room had been on him since he came. They followed him now, those eyes, expecting him to stop at the beauty by the window or the heiress near the card-room. He did neither. He stopped before Miss Charlotte Merrick, who was 28, and had been sitting out the dances against the wall with the chaperones and the plain girls, and he bowed, and he asked her to stand up with him. There was a small silence in the near part of the room, the kind that is louder than noise. Charlotte, who had been half asleep behind her fan and wholly resigned to another evening of watching, looked up and understood that he was speaking to her only after he had asked a second time. She had a plain, broad, honest face and steady grey eyes and hands that were browner than a lady's ought to be from her hours in the glass-house, and she was dressed well but without art, in a gown 2 seasons old that her mother had despaired of, and she was the last creature in that hot, bright room who had expected to be asked to dance by anyone at all, let alone by a duke. She rose because it would have been rude to refuse, and she gave him her hand because he had held it out, and she let him lead her onto the floor while the whole assembly rearranged its opinions with an almost audible click. It was her sister who put the general thought into words, though she did it low, behind a painted fan, to the 2 young ladies beside her, and did not trouble greatly whether it carried. Isabella Merrick was 21 and beautiful in the way that stops conversation, all bright dark curls and a waist a man might span, and she had come to the assembly certain of her own triumph, and had watched a duke walk past her to her dull elder sister, and it had not sat well. He only wants her dowry. She snapped the fan shut. What else could a man like that want with Charlotte? £12,000 will make even a great-aunt spinster look handsome across a ballroom. And the 2 young ladies laughed behind their gloves, because it was witty, and because it was cruel, and because they had wondered the very same thing, and were glad someone had said it aloud. Charlotte did not hear the words. She was too far out on the floor by then, and too occupied in the strange business of dancing with a man who danced well and said little, and looked at her as though she were a person rather than a purse. But she knew what the room was thinking without needing to hear it, for she had lived 28 years as the plain sister of a beauty, and she could read a ballroom the way her father read the sky before rain. She knew that not one soul among them believed the Duke of Ashfield had crossed the floor for her sake, and she knew, being an honest woman, that she was more than half inclined to agree with them, and that this was the saddest part of all. To understand why, one must understand the Merricks and the manner of their living. They held a modest estate called Lark Hollow in a green fold of the Somerset Hills, a comfortable old house with an orchard and a walled garden, and rents that kept them respectable, without ever quite keeping them grand. Miss Merrick, the father, was a mild, gouty man who cared for his hounds and his cellar, and left the ordering of everything else to his wife, and Mrs. Merrick cared for nothing on this earth so much as the advancement of her daughters, and had done from the hour each was born. She had reared Isabella to be beautiful, and Charlotte to be useful, and she had succeeded in both, and if she loved them differently, she would have denied it to her dying breath, and everyone who knew the family could see it plain. The one thing that lifted the Merricks above their neighbours was not the estate at all. It was the fortune that had come to Charlotte alone, some 4 years past, from a maternal great-aunt named Hester Combe, a fierce old woman who had never married and had lived to 90 in a house full of cats and account books, and who had left the whole of her considerable savings, £12,000 in the funds, to the one grandniece she judged to have a head on her shoulders. She had said as much in the will, in a codicil that scandalised the family, declaring that Isabella would be provided for by her face and needed no money to spoil her, but that Charlotte, being sensible, should have the means to be sensible with. It was the making of Charlotte and the undoing of her peace in a single stroke, for from that day she had been, in her own family and in the wider world, not a woman at all, but a son. And she had learnt the difference between being wanted and being valued the way one learns a language, slowly and with pain. She had not let it sour her, which was to her great credit. She managed the money shrewdly, better than her father managed the estate, and she gave a good deal of it away where it was needed, quietly. To a tenant behind with his rent or a widow with a leaking roof, and she kept the rest in the funds and did not touch her own comfort with it. For she had no wish to be grand. What she loved was her glass house, a long lean-to of glass and white-painted iron that her great-aunt's money had let her build against the south wall of the walled garden, and there she raised things that had no business growing in a Somerset winter, oranges and lemons in tubs and a vine and orchids sent her by a nurseryman in Chelsea, and she kept a botanical notebook in a small firm hand, and knew the Latin names of things, and did not care that a young lady was not supposed to have earth under her fingernails. It was the one place at Lark Hollow that was wholly her own, and she was happier among her plants than in any drawing-room in the county, and this too the neighbours found peculiar in a woman worth £12,000. The Duke of Ashfield had come into the county that summer to visit an old friend from his army years, a colonel who kept a house near the market town, and he had been at the assembly out of politeness and a wish to escape a dinner of the colonel's tedious relations. He had not meant to dance, he had certainly not meant to be remarked upon, for being remarked upon was a thing he had spent 5 years learning to avoid. But he had stood at the edge of the room in the heat and the noise, and he had watched the bright turning wheel of the county's marriageable daughters, and he had found the whole display faintly unbearable, all those young faces arranged for his inspection, all those mothers angling him like a fish. And then his eye had fallen on a plain woman against the wall, who was plainly not angling for anything, who sat with her back straight and her fan half forgotten, and a look on her honest face of someone enduring a duty in a distant and private good humour. And he had felt, for the first time in a long weary while, curious. He was 32. Was Julian, 5th Duke of Ashfield, and he had a hard-won stillness about him that people took for pride, and grief lay under it, and something colder than grief, which was the memory of having been made a fool of. His father, the 4th Duke, had been a charming ruinous man who gambled the great estate to the edge of the abyss, and died leaving debts that would have frightened a nation, and Julian had come into the title at 27 to find a dukedom that was mostly mortgage, and a name that the world pronounced with a knowing pity. He had spent the 5 years since in a labour of quiet retrenchment that no one had seen and no one credited, selling the London house, closing wings, disputing every false claim, restoring acre by acre what his father had thrown away by the county. He had very nearly done it. But the world's picture of a man is slow to change, and the world still saw the ruined son of a ruined father, a duke with a great title and an empty coffer, a man who must, of course, marry money. There had been a woman in the worst of those years. He did not think of her often now, having taught himself not to, but she was part of the coldness under the stillness, and she belonged to this story whether he wished it or not. Her name had been Cassandra, and she had been beautiful and clever, and he had loved her with the whole undefended heart of a young man who did not yet know what his father's dice would cost him. She had loved him too, or he had believed she did, until the debts came to light, and then he had watched her weigh him, quite openly, the way a careful buyer weighs a horse gone lame, and find him wanting, and marry within the year a marquis 3 times her age with a fortune that had never seen a card table. She had not even been ashamed. She had told him, kindly, that a woman must be practical, that love was a luxury for the solvent, and that he would understand when he was older. He was older now. He understood that he would never again let anyone value him by his purse, full or empty, and that he would rather die a bachelor than be married for money, or, worse, be pitied for his want of it. So when the county whispered, as it began to whisper within a day of the assembly, that the ruined Duke of Ashfield had set his cap at the Merrick fortune that a man with a mortgaged dukedom had wisely fixed on the one girl in Somerset with £12,000 in the funds, he heard it and said nothing, and it curdled in him like old milk. It was the very thing that had been said of him for 5 years, the very shape the world always pressed him into, and to have it said now of the first woman in years who had made him curious was a particular cruelty. He might have withdrawn then. It would have been the safe course, the course his coldness counselled. Instead, he did a reckless thing. He called at Larkhollow. He came on a warm, bright morning with the dew still on the orchard grass, and he was shown into a drawing-room where Mrs. Merrick received him in a flutter of triumph, so violent she could scarcely pour the tea. And Isabella arranged herself in the best light by the window, and Charlotte was sent for from the garden, and came in with her sleeves still turned back, and a smudge of green on her wrist, having been given no time to make herself fine, and mortified by it, and defiant in her mortification. The Duke of Ashfield rose when she entered, which he had not done for the others, and he looked at the smudge on her wrist and the earth beneath her nails, and something in his grave face eased, as though he had been afraid of finding one thing and had found another. He asked her, before her mother could steer the talk to more advantageous ground, what she had been doing in the garden. And Charlotte, too honest and too flustered to be clever, told him the truth, that she had been repotting a seedling orange that had outgrown its tub, and that she had very likely ruined the whole visit by appearing before a duke with dirt on her hands. You appear before me as a woman who does something with her days. I find I have met a great many who do not, and I have not once found it improved them. And Mrs. Merrick, who did not know what to make of this, laughed too loudly, and Isabella's beautiful face went briefly still, and Charlotte looked at the Duke of Ashfield across the tea-things, and felt the first small dangerous stirring of a hope she knew she must not entertain. For she had seen the county's letter as clearly as anyone. She had done the sum herself. A ruined duke, a spinster of 28, and £12,000. There was only one way that sum came out, and it was not the way her foolish heart wished it would. He came again. That was the beginning of it, the calling and the coming again, through the long golden end of that summer, while the orchards reddened and the harvest came in, and the county watched and calculated. He was a difficult man to know, reserved to the point of severity, given to long silences that Mrs. Merrick filled with chatter, and Isabella with archness, and Charlotte, blessedly, did not feel the need to fill at all. It was the silences, in the end, that undid them both. For Charlotte was a woman comfortable with quiet, having spent her life being talked past rather than talked to, and the Duke of Ashfield was a man starved of anyone who did not fear his silence or scheme within it, and the first time they sat together in the walled garden, and said nothing for a quarter of an hour, and were both at their ease, each understood something about the other that no amount of conversation could have taught. There was a Sunday soon after that the whole county remembered long afterward, though nothing happened at it that a stranger would have thought worth the telling. The Merricks kept their pew near the front of the little church at Larkhollow, and the Duke of Ashfield came to service with the colonel and sat 3 rows back. And all through the sermon the parish divided its attention between the pulpit and the question of where a duke would choose to stand when the service let out. He chose, when it let out, to stand in the porch beside Charlotte, who had lingered as she always did to speak with old Mrs. Tuck about her rheumatism and the poultice that eased it, and he listened to the whole of that dull kind conversation with a grave attention that Mrs. Tuck talked of for a year, and he offered the old woman his arm down the 2 worn steps she feared in the wet, and he did it as though it were the most natural thing on earth, and not a thing the county would chew over at every dinner table for a fortnight. Isabella, watching from the churchyard, understood before Charlotte did that a man does not trouble himself with a tenant's grandmother to impress a woman he means to marry for money, and it frightened her, and she said nothing and began to think. He asked her once, in those early weeks, about the great-aunt whose money had so changed her situation, and Charlotte told him the truth of it, that Hester Combe had been a hard old woman whom nobody loved and everybody feared, who had kept cats because they did not flatter her and account books because they did not lie, and who had left her fortune to the one grand-niece she thought would not be spoiled by it. He listened, and was quiet a while, and said that he thought he should have liked the great-aunt, that a person who valued a clear eye over a soft word was rarer than the world supposed, and generally right. And Charlotte, who had spent 4 years being pitied for the manner of her inheritance, and lectured on the burden of it, found herself telling this grave stranger things she had told no one, how the money had made her a son instead of a sister, how she had learned to read a room by the way its eyes moved from her face to some invisible figure hung about her neck, and he heard her out without once offering the easy comfort that would have proved he had not understood. And when she had done, he only said that he knew something of being reckoned a figure rather than a man, and neither of them said anything more, and the understanding between them grew another quiet inch in the space where the words had been. She showed him the glass house, because he asked, and because no one had ever asked before. She had expected him to admire it the way visitors did, with a vague and hurried politeness, and to be gone in 5 minutes. Instead, he moved down the long warm aisle between the tubs and the staging, with a slow real attention, and he asked her the names of things, and when she gave them in Latin he gave them back correctly, and named their families, for it turned out that the Duke of Ashfield had a botanical turn of his own, and had corresponded with the very Chelsea nurseryman who had sent her the orchids, and knew a great deal about the raising of tender plants under glass. They stood together over a flowering thing she had coaxed against all odds to bloom, a waxy pale bloom no bigger than a thumbnail that had cost her 2 years of patience, and he looked at it for a long moment and then looked at her, and said that patience of that kind was the rarest quality he knew of, and that most people wanted the flower without the 2 years, and that he had begun to think the whole of a person's character might be read in whether they could wait. Charlotte, standing in the green warmth of the only place that was wholly hers, with the Duke admiring her orchid and, she began to fear, admiring her, felt the dangerous hope grow another inch, and could not stop it. A week after he had stood over her orchid, a parcel came for her from the market town, carried out by the carrier with the ordinary post, and Charlotte opened it in the glass house with earth still on her fingers, and found inside a book, a heavy handsome volume on the cultivation of tender exotics under glass, newly printed and costly. The very book she had wanted for 2 years, and had told no one she wanted. There was no letter with it, only a card in a plain firm hand that said he had found he owned 2 copies, and could not think what to do with the second, which was a transparent fiction, for the book was so new that no man could yet own 1 copy by accident, let alone 2. Charlotte sat down on her potting stool and held the book in her lap, and did not open it for a long while, because a gift chosen so exactly is a more dangerous thing than any compliment. A compliment being aimed at the person one wishes a woman to be, and a gift like that being aimed straight at the person she is. She thought of returning it, as a sensible woman ought, and she did not return it, and she read it by candle that night until the small hours, and she knew as she read that she was in a great deal more danger than she had let herself understand. For his part, the Duke of Ashfield was discovering, with a mixture of alarm and a feeling he had thought burned out of him for good, that he looked forward to the road to Lark Hollow. He had come into Somerset meaning to stay a fortnight, and be gone, and the fortnight had become a month, and the month was lengthening, and the colonel, who had known him since the army, and had watched him build his wall stone by stone across 5 hard years, said nothing but observed a great deal. Julian told himself it was the botany that drew him, the rare pleasure of a mind that knew a plant by its right name and had earned the knowing, and he half believed it, in the way a man believes the smaller truth to keep from looking at the larger. He was 32, and he had promised himself, over the wreck of everything Cassandra had taught him, that he would never again put his happiness into the keeping of another person, and he could feel that promise straining, and he did not know yet whether he hoped it would hold or break. What he knew was that a plain grey-eyed woman with earth under her nails had walked into the one room of him he had bricked up after his father died, and had done it without knocking, without seeming to try, simply by being what she was, and that he had not had the will to put her out. There was an afternoon late in the season when he came upon her not in the drawing-room, but in the walled garden, on her knees among the late beds with a trug beside her, lifting and dividing the crowns of some drab unlovely root that she promised him would be glory itself the following spring. He did not stand over her and admire. He took off his coat, to her astonishment and the lasting scandal of the gardener's boy who saw it, and he knelt in the dirt beside her and asked to be shown how it was done. And she showed him, and he did it clumsily at first and then well, and the two of them worked down the long bed together in the September light, with the wasps loud in the fallen pears, and said almost nothing, and were entirely content. When it was finished he looked at the earth ground into his own hands, the hands of a duke, and he laughed, a short surprised sound that she had not heard from him before, and said that his grandmother would have wept to see it, and that he could not remember when he had last passed an hour so well. Charlotte, kneeling in her old stuff gown with her heart going like a hammer, understood that this was the most dangerous thing he had done yet, more dangerous than the book or the orchid or the naming of her plants, for a man may counterfeit a compliment and even a kindness, but no fortune hunter alive would kneel in the dirt for the pleasure of it, and she began, against all her sense, to believe. The gesture that fixed the thing in her heart, past all her sensible resistance, had nothing to do with any of this. It came at the end of August, when a fever went through the cottages on the low ground by the river, the kind that comes with the late summer damp, and one of the Lark Hollow tenants, a carter named Dyer with a wife and 4 small children, was taken with it badly. Mist, Merrick, mild and useless, said it was a great pity, and stayed indoors. Mrs. Merrick said it was dangerous to go near such places, and forbade the girls to think of it. Charlotte, who had a key to the still room, and a great-aunt's £12,000, and no patience with being forbidden, went anyway, quietly, with broth and physic and money for the doctor, as she had gone 100 times before to 100 cottages, asking no leave and wanting no notice. And there, in the low, dark, reeking cottage by the river, she found the Duke of Ashfield already at the bedside, in his shirt-sleeves, holding a basin while the surgeon bled the carter, having heard of the sickness from the colonel, and come out on his own account to see what a landlord's neighbour might do. He had not known she would come. He was as surprised as she was, and for a moment neither of them knew where to look, caught out in the same secret kindness. Then Charlotte simply set down her basket and turned back her sleeves and went to work, and he stayed and worked beside her, and the two of them, a duke and an heiress, spent the better part of that day, and the evening after it, in a carter's cottage nursing a poor man through the crisis of a fever, while his terrified wife wept and his children clung to their skirts. They said very little. There was little to say, but when at last the fever broke toward morning, and the man slept easy and the danger passed, they stood together in the cottage doorway in the grey dawn, with the river mist rising off the water meadows, both of them worn and dirty and quietly glad, and Charlotte understood that whatever the county said, whatever the sum came to, this was not a man who did such things for the sake of £12,000. No one bled a carter for a dowry, and the Duke of Ashfield, looking at the plain, worn, honest face of the woman who had come as secretly as he had, and worked as hard, and wanted as little to be seen, understood that he had at last found a person who valued a thing for itself, and not for what the world would pay for it. which was the one quality he had come to prize above every other on the earth. They walked back together toward Larkhollow through the wet meadows in the risen sun, not speaking, the mist burning off the grass around them and the larks going up, and at the stile where their ways parted, his toward the Colonel's and hers toward home, they stopped, and there was a moment when a word might have been said that would have carried them past all the trouble that came after. Neither said it. He was thinking of Cassandra and of the long cold discipline of 5 years, and she was thinking of the sum the county reckoned, and each of them, out of an old wound, let the moment pass. He handed her over the stile, and his hand closed hard on hers for the length of a breath before he let it go, and that was all, and it was a great deal, and they parted in the wet gold morning, each carrying the same unspoken thing home to be turned over in the dark. It is the plainest of truths, and the cruellest, that the very care which draws two guarded people together is the same care that keeps each of them from being the first to speak. He said nothing of love. He was not ready, and neither was she, and there was a great deal of the summer's caution still between them. But something was settled in both their hearts that dawn in the cottage doorway, and it might have ripened sweetly and slowly into the thing it was plainly becoming, had they been let alone. They were not let alone. For Isabella Merrick had been watching all summer with a rising and particular fury, and she was a young woman who had never in her life been passed over, and did not mean to begin at 21, and least of all in favour of Charlotte, whom she had spent her life outshining as easily as breathing. That her dull earth-stained elder sister should be courted by a duke, while she herself was courted by nothing better than the curate and a half-pay lieutenant, was a wrong she could not sit under, and she set herself, with the cold cleverness her beauty usually made unnecessary, to end it. She had a weapon ready to hand, for the county's whisper was her weapon, and she had only to sharpen it and aim it well. She made it her business, over the weeks that followed, to learn everything that could be learned of the Duke of Ashfield's affairs, and there was a great deal to learn if one went about it with malice, for the shape of his father's ruin was known, and the labour of his repair was not, and a clever girl could tell the first half of that story, and leave out the second, and produce a very ugly picture indeed. She learned of the mortgaged acres and the sold London house and the closed wings, and she learned, most usefully of all, the old tale of Cassandra, the beauty who had thrown him over when the debts came out, and she saw at once how that tale might be turned. She began to drop her poison in small doses, sweetly, where it would do the most harm, which was into her sister's own ear. The county helped her without knowing it helped, as a county always will. There was no malice in most of them, only the ordinary appetite for a story with a figure in it, and the story of the ruined Duke and the great-aunt's £12,000 was too good a one to let lie. It was told over cards and across pews and along the lanes at market, improved a little with each telling, until the whole neighbourhood held it for settled fact that the Duke of Ashfield had come into Somerset a hunting money and had run his quarry to earth at Larkhollow, and the very people who bowed to him at church went home and reckoned his debts at their firesides. Isabella had only to gather what floated freely on the air and distill it, and pour it where it would work, and the county, gossiping idly and meaning no great harm, brewed the poison that the sister administered with intent. It is one of the quiet cruelties of the world that a lie needs no author when everyone is willing to be its carrier, and that a good man's name may be spent like a coin by people who would each swear they had wished him no ill at all. She did it as sisters do, under the cover of concern. She would come to the glass-house where Charlotte worked, and sit prettily on a stool and wonder aloud, in a voice full of tender worry, whether dear Charlotte had considered that a duke so very ruined must marry money or sink. That a man whose own coldness had once driven away a woman he loved was not a man to warm to a plain wife. That it was a strange thing, was it not, for so great a personage to fix on Charlotte of all the women in Somerset, unless of course there was some very solid reason for it, some reason with a figure attached. She never said the cruel thing outright. Not at first. She only asked and wondered and let the questions do their work, and the work they did was terrible, for they fell on the one soft, undefended place in Charlotte's steady heart. The place that had known since childhood that she was the sister no one chose for herself. Charlotte fought it. She was not a fool, and she loved her plants and her account books and her own good sense. And she told herself 100 times that a man who bled a carter in his shirt sleeves at dawn did not do it for a dowry, that the sum did not always come out the way the county reckoned it. But Isabella was patient and clever, and she knew exactly where to press, and the poison went deep, and there came a day when Charlotte looked at the Duke of Ashfield across her mother's drawing-room, and could no longer see the man who had named her orchids and held the carter's basin. She could see only the sum. A ruined duke, a plain spinster. £12,000, and she began, out of the oldest wound she had, to draw back from him, to be cool where she had been easy, to answer his silences with silences of her own that were no longer companionable but wary. And he felt the change at once, being a man exquisitely attuned to exactly this, to being weighed and found to be a fortune hunter, and it woke every cold and guarded thing in him that Charlotte's honesty had begun to lay to rest. He came to Larkhollow once more before the dinner that broke them, on an afternoon of low grey cloud, and he found a different Charlotte from the one he had walked home with through the larks. She received him in the drawing-room with her mother by, correct and cool and careful, and she did not take him to the glass house, and when he spoke of the orchids she answered in the shortest civil words and looked at her hands. He was too proud to ask what had changed, and she was too wounded to tell him, and the two of them who had once sat a quarter of an hour in easy silence now sat 10 minutes in a silence like a shut door, while Mrs. Merrick chattered on, delighted, mistaking the frost in the room for the proper reserve of two people about to be grandly engaged. When he rose to go he paused at the door and looked back at her, once, with something in his grave face that she would remember all the fortnight of her grief and be unable to name, and then the cold came down over it. The old practised cold, and he bowed and was gone. And Charlotte told herself that she had seen a fortune hunter disappointed of his fortune, and did not believe it even as she thought it, and clung to it because the truth was worse. The thing came to its crisis, as such things do, in company, before witnesses, at a dinner Mrs. Merrick gave at Larkhollow in the first week of September, a dinner meant to display to the neighbourhood how very near the Merricks now stood to a coronet. The Duke of Ashfield was there, and the Colonel, and a dozen of the county's best, and the table shone with the plate misses. Merrick had inherited, and the confidence she had not earned, and Isabella, seeing her sister already half turned from the Duke and judging the ground ripe, chose that table, that lit and crowded table, to strike the blow she had been sharpening all the summer. She did it lightly, as if in play, when the talk had turned to a recent marriage in a neighbouring family that all the world knew to be mercenary on both sides. She laughed her pretty laugh and said that at least those two were honest about it, not like some, who dressed up the plain arithmetic of a dowry as a great romance and thought no one could see the figures under the flowers. And then, into the small pause that followed, with her bright eyes on her sister and her voice pitched to carry the length of the table, Isabella said the thing. "He only wants your dowry, Charlotte. Everyone in the county knows it. A ruined duke and a great-aunt's £12,000, and you sitting there believing a man like that could want plain sensible you for yourself. It would be a kindness for someone to tell you before you make a spectacle of the family." And she smiled sweetly, as though she had done her sister the greatest favour in the world, and she reached for her wine, and the whole bright table sat frozen and appalled and secretly agog, for the cruel thing had been said aloud at last, and there was no unsaying it. Charlotte did not weep. She had a great deal of her great-aunt Hester in her, more than anyone had guessed, and in the worst moment of her life she found she could not weep in front of these people, and would not. But the blood went out of her face and left it grey, and she looked down at her hands. the brown, capable hands with the earth she could never quite scrub out, and she believed her sister utterly. Because the wound Isabella had aimed at was 28 years old and had never healed, and because it is always easier to believe the cruel thing than the kind one. She did not look at the Duke of Ashfield. She could not, and so she did not see his face, which had gone perfectly still and perfectly cold in the way that had earned him his reputation, nor did she understand, in that first stunned moment, that the stillness was not the stillness of a man exposed, but the stillness of a man wounded past bearing by watching the one honest woman he had ever found be taught, in public, by her own sister, to see him as everyone else had always seen him. He rose from the table. He did it quietly, with a control that cost him more than anyone there could know, and he thanked Mrs. Merrick for her hospitality in a voice like the frost that comes before winter, and he said that he found he had stayed too long in the county and must return to his own affairs, and he made his bow to the company and to Charlotte, who still could not lift her eyes to him, and he went out into the September night, and was gone, and Isabella, watching him go, believed she had won, and so did the county, and so in the ruin of her heart did Charlotte, who lay awake that whole long night in the certainty that she had been a fool to hope, that the sum had come out as sums always did, and that a plain woman with a fortune was only ever a fortune with a plain woman attached. In the days that followed that dinner the house at Lark Hollow settled into a false and brittle peace. Mrs. Merrick veered between fury at the lost coronet and a determined public account in which the Duke had never been serious and the family had never been fooled, and she required Charlotte to confirm this account to callers, which Charlotte did, tonelessly, because it cost less than the truth. Isabella was much in looks that week and much in company, and she took care to be seen at her sweetest, for she had learned that cruelty prospers best when it is quickly followed by charm, and she believed the matter closed and herself the cleverer for it. Only once did her certainty waver. She came upon her sister in the glass-house late one evening, standing quite still before the little orchid that had cost 2 years, not working, only looking at it, and something in the set of Charlotte's shoulders made Isabella pause at the door with the cruel word already in her mouth, and swallow it, and go quietly away, and she did not afterward examine why she had done so, because the answer was shame and she had no practice at it. She did not see him for a fortnight. The county said he had gone back to his mortgaged dukedom to hunt an easier heiress, and Isabella said so most of all, and Mrs. Merrick lamented the coronet that had slipped away, and blamed everyone but herself. And Charlotte said nothing at all, and went to her glass-house, and worked among her plants with a grey set face, and let no one see how deep the thing had cut. That the plants knew, or she told them, for she found herself talking to the seedling orange as she had once meant to talk to a duke, telling it that patience was a fool's virtue after all, that she had waited 2 years for one small flower and a whole life for one person to want her for herself, and that both had been a waste, and that she would content herself henceforth with what she could grow under glass, which at least never pretended to love her, and never wanted her money. The days of that fortnight went by slow and grey, one very like another, and Charlotte kept to her work, because work was the one thing that had never yet failed her. She potted and pruned and made her careful entries in the botanical notebook in her small firm hand, and she visited the cartered dyer, who was mending well, and asked after the grave gentleman who had held the basin, and she had no answer to give him. She walked the wet lanes on the estate business her father neglected, and her mother thought beneath a lady, settling a dispute over a boundary hedge, and forgiving a quarter's rent to the widow Sop, whose roof had at last let go. And she did these things as she had always done them, quietly and well, and took no comfort from them for the first time in her life. At night she lay awake, and did the sum over and over in the dark, the ruined duke and the plain spinster and the £12,000, and every time it came out the same, and every time some small stubborn part of her that would not be silenced insisted that no sum on earth accounted for a man who bled a carter at dawn and offered his arm to old Mrs. tuck in the church porch and knelt in the dirt of her garden for the plain pleasure of it. She did not know what to do with that part of herself, so she tried to starve it, and it would not starve, and that, though she did not yet know it, was the truest thing about her. She was wrong about the Duke of Ashfield, as it happened, and she learned how wrong on a grey, wet morning in the 3rd week of September, when the surgeon's boy brought word to Larkollo that would change everything, though it did not seem so at first. He had not gone back to his dukedom to hunt an heiress. He had gone no further than the colonel's house, and there he had sat for a fortnight in a cold fury that slowly, painfully, cooled into something clearer, for the Duke of Ashfield was a just man under his pride, and justice, given time, will get the better of pride in a just man. He had reasoned it out as he reasoned out his accounts, coldly and to the bottom. He had asked himself whether Charlotte had done him a wrong, and he had been forced to answer that she had not, that a woman taught from the cradle that she was wanted only for her money could hardly be blamed for believing it of him when her own sister swore to it at a dinner table. He had asked himself whether he loved her, and he had been unable, for all his coldness, to answer anything but yes. And he had asked himself, last of all, what a man does when the woman he loves has been made to doubt him in the one particular he could least bear to be doubted in, and he had found, sitting alone at the colonel's fire, that there was in fact one answer, one clean and total answer, and that it was in his power to give it. The notion, once it came to him, had the clean hard rightness of a thing that solves an equation, and it pleased the exact and orderly part of his mind even as it frightened the rest. He knew what the world would say. A man did not sign away £12,000. A settlement carried a bride's fortune to her husband, as a river carries water to the sea, by the plain law of the land and the plain expectation of every family that had ever married a daughter, and to reverse it, to bind the money to the woman past his own reach forever, was a thing so unheard of that his own man of business questioned him twice, gravely, whether he had considered what he did. He had considered it. He had considered little else for a week. He understood that he was proposing to make himself, in law and before witnesses, the one thing no fortune hunter could counterfeit and no lie could survive, and that if she refused him after it, as she might, he would have given away a fortune and got nothing back but the knowledge that he had told the truth in the only tongue that could not lie. He found, testing it against his cold and careful heart, that he was willing to pay exactly that, and the discovery told him more about the state of his own feeling than any amount of looking inward had managed to do in a month. He did not send a letter. He did not call and plead his case, for pleading proves nothing, and words were the very things his father had ruined the family with. He did something better. He sent for his man of business from London, and he sent for the family's man of law from the market town, and he had drawn up, in the proper form, with every seal and signature the law could require, a deed of a very particular kind. Then he wrote to Mr. Merrick, not to Charlotte, a short courteous note requesting the honour of calling upon the family on a matter of business, and naming a day, and asking that the family's lawyer be present, and Mrs. Merrick, reading it over her husband's shoulder, gave a shriek of pure joy, for she understood a settlement when she saw one coming, and believed the coronet had after all come home. The morning he came was clear and cool, the first breath of autumn in it, and the whole family was assembled in the good drawing-room. Mrs. Merrick in his best coat and his gout, Mrs. Merrick quivering with triumph, Isabella pale and watchful and no longer quite so sure, and the family's lawyer, a dry, precise old man named Pruitt, with his papers on the table before him. Charlotte was there because she had been made to be there, in a plain grey gown, with her hands folded in her lap and her heart shut up tight, having resolved to bear the settlement of her own dowry upon a man who wanted only her dowry with all the dignity her great-aunt had left her, and to feel nothing, and to be got through it. She did not look up when the Duke of Ashfield was announced. She looked at her folded hands. He came in with his own lawyer and his man of business and a leather case of papers, and he was grave and formal and did not once look at Isabella. And he wished the company good morning and took the chair that was offered and came directly to his business, for he was not a man to waste words when acts would serve. He said that he had a proposal to lay before the family and a deed to lay before their lawyer, and that he begged their patience while both were read, and he nodded to his own man of law, who cleared his throat and unfolded the first paper, and read out, in the flat, careful voice of his profession, that the said Julian, 5th Duke of Ashfield, proposed marriage to Miss Charlotte Merrick of Larkhollow. Mrs. Merrick clasped her hands. It was no more than she had known. And then the lawyer unfolded the second paper, the particular deed, and began to read that, and the room, which had relaxed into triumph, went slowly and strangely still. For the deed did not settle Charlotte's fortune upon her husband. As every marriage settlement in the memory of everyone in that room had done, the whole of a bride's money passing into the hand and the control of the man she married, as the law provided and the world expected. The deed did the opposite. It settled the entire sum of £12,000, the whole of great-aunt Hester Coomb's legacy. Every last farthing of the dowry that the county said he had come for, upon Charlotte Merrick alone, in a trust for her sole and separate use, to be hers absolutely, in her own name and her own control, so that no husband, not the Duke of Ashfield himself, should ever have the touching or the ordering, or the smallest claim upon one penny of it, whether they married or whether they did not. Now and for the whole of her life. He had signed away, before he ever married her, the very thing he was said to have courted her for. He had renounced the dowry entirely, and given it back to her, and made it so that she should be, uniquely among the wives of England, a woman whose fortune remained forever and inalienably her own. The lawyer finished reading, and the silence in the room was absolute. Mrs. Merrick's face had gone from triumph to bewilderment to something like horror, for she did not understand a man who threw away £12,000 and could not conceive of a reason for it. Isabella had gone white to the lips, for she understood it perfectly, and understood in the same instant that every word of her poison had been not merely a cruelty but a lie, and that she had been proven a liar before the whole county by a deed with a seal upon it. And Charlotte, who had come into that room resolved to feel nothing, lifted her head at last and looked at the Duke of Ashfield across the papers and the plate and the ruin of her sister's malice, and found that he was already looking at her, and had been looking at her the whole time, waiting for her to understand. He spoke then, and he spoke only to her, as though the rest of the room had ceased to exist. He had heard what her sister said, he told her, and had understood, in the fortnight since, that a woman may be forgiven for believing a lie she has been told her whole life. He could not stand up in a drawing-room and swear that he did not want her money, because any fortune hunter alive could swear the same, and every one of them did. Words were cheap, he went on, and had ruined his family, and he had resolved to answer the charge against him in the only language that could not lie, which was the language of a signed and sealed and witnessed deed. The money was hers, wholly and forever hers, and he had made it so before she gave him any answer, so that whatever she chose she should know past all doubting that it was chosen freely, for he wanted her, and he had wanted her from the first moment he saw her enduring an assembly with an orange seedling's patience, and he wanted her with her fortune wholly her own and out of his reach forever, which he hoped might at last make plain the one thing he had found no words good enough to say. He rose from his chair, and he crossed the room to where she sat, as he had crossed the whole length of the assembly on the night this all began, past the mother and the sister and the lawyers, and he stopped before her and held out his hand, exactly as he had held it out to a plain woman against a ballroom wall, and he asked her, quietly, before them all, whether she would have him. A ruined duke who was not so ruined as the county believed and never had been, and who did not want and would never touch one penny of her £12,000. but who wanted, past sense and past pride, and past every cold thing he had taught himself, the woman it was attached to. And Charlotte Merrick, who had waited 28 years to be chosen for herself, and had ceased to believe she ever would be, looked at the deed on the table that had given her back her fortune and her freedom in the same stroke, and looked at the hand held out to her, and looked at the grave, uncertain, hopeful face of the man who had answered a lie with the one thing no liar would ever do. And she put her earth-stained hand in his, and let him raise her to her feet, and the whole appalled and dazzled room understood that the sum had, after all, come out the other way. They were married in the little church at Larkhollow in the last of the golden weather, and it was a quiet wedding by a duke's measure, and a grand one by the county's, and Isabella stood among the bridesmaids with a fixed and beautiful smile, and left the county soon after for a long visit to relations, from which she returned much chastened, and eventually married her half-pay lieutenant, who loved her, and had never once thought about her sister's money, and it was the making of her, in the end, though that is another story. Mrs. Merrick told everyone for the rest of her life that she had arranged the whole match, and no one contradicted her, because it was not worth the trouble. And Mr. Merrick gave his sensible daughter away with real tears in his gouty old eyes, having understood, later than he should have, that she had been the best of his household all along. Charlotte kept her £12,000 her whole life, in her own name, in her own control, and she used it as she had always used it, wisely and generously, and her husband never once asked her what she did with it, which was itself a kind of daily proof that renewed the first great proof and never let it grow old. They restored Ashfield together, the estate his father had gambled and he had all but saved, and they built a great glass house there, far larger than the one at Larkhollow, and filled it with tender things from every warm corner of the earth. And the Duke of Ashfield, who had been thought the coldest and proudest man in 3 counties, was to be found on most mornings in his shirt-sleeves among the orange trees with earth beneath. His nails, at his wife's side, waiting with her the 2 long years it takes to bring a difficult thing to flower, for he had told her once that the whole of a person's character might be read in whether they could wait, and he had found, in her, the one person patient enough to be worth the whole of his own long waiting. Years on, when they had children of their own and the county had long forgotten it had ever thought ill of either of them, there came an evening at the county assembly, the same hot bright room with the same guttering candles and the same fiddles sawing out a reel, and the Duke of Ashfield, no longer young, crossed the whole length of the floor past a new generation of ambitious mothers and there arranged daughters, and stopped before his wife, who was sitting out the dances by choice now, comfortable and grey-eyed and content, and he bowed, and he asked her to stand up with him. And Charlotte, Duchess of Ashfield, who owned her own fortune and her own glass-house and, past all early doubting, her own husband's whole undefended heart, looked up at the man who had once answered the cruellest lie of her life with a deed no fortune-hunter would ever sign, and she laughed and gave him her earth-stained hand and let him lead her out onto the floor, where the wheel of the dance turned bright around them, and not one soul in that room supposed for a moment that he had crossed it for anything on this earth but her. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.